What's good, everyone? Excited to have Amber Delbert, who actually
Divert.
was
Yeah.
Dalbert. What is it?
Divert. You'll die if you say it wrong.
Oh, Dibert. I should get the name right. Introducing
Cool. It's
you.
cool.
And she has a history in sales enablement and being a sales trainer, working for some world-class organizations. And it's been a privilege to get to know you better. And I know you coach multi-million dollar quota, a lot of enterprise AEs and a lot of
Mhm.
tech sellers. So this is going to be a treat for a lot of people here.
Yeah.
And yeah, if you guys have any questions, feel free to type it in the chat as well. But we're going to be talking about the the mental health and the state of mindset for a lot of tech sellers, and just share some of the trends and what's going on, and also give you some insights on imposter syndrome, how to overcome it, all that good stuff. So
Mhm.
welcome, Amber.
Thank you. I mean, it's so fun to meet other people who care about the same weird things that you care about. Every time I talk to you, I'm like, I think we're best friends.
Yeah, yeah. There's not a lot of people doing specifically imposter syndrome for tech sellers. So
Right.
this is a big topic, and we'll dig deep into it. Why you're so passionate about this topic. A little bit more about your background, right? Because people might see you from the outside and be like, "Oh, she's killing it. She's coaching people that are
Yeah.
making millions of dollars. She must know what she's talking about." But we'll share a little bit more about your journey and why you got into this work, and a little bit more about what you're seeing in terms of common themes your that your clients are dealing with as well, so we could be more
Mhm.
specific about those use cases as well.
Like, where should we start? Should we start with trends?
Yeah, yeah, that'd be good.
Okay, so I'm curious to see from your side what you're seeing as well. But from my side, I definitely see a lot of people who I guess like separate from imposter syndrome, kind of like the state of mindset in sales right now. What I'm seeing is a lot of people who are a little bit panicking. It feels like 2023 was a dumpster fire for most tech sellers. And 2024 is showing some promise, but it's not quite picking up to like 2021 levels or 2022 levels or 2020 levels. Like we had some really good years back there. And so I do think people are in their heads right now and they're kind of panicking of like, okay, this year started out good, but it's not quite going as well as I thought it was going to go. And I'm not quite up to my quota attainment that I thought I would be at this point of the year. And so definitely see a lot of people who are second guessing themselves and it's almost like watching a plane crash slowly. Like you're like, no, I think it's going to be okay, but man, it sure looks like it's going to crash. And so you almost get in your head and start spiraling out of like, it's going to be the same as last year. It's not going to be as good as it was. Um, and I'm definitely seeing a lot of people who are like kind of starting to get in that downward spiral of like, oh no, it's not working. See, it's not working. Oh no, it's not working. Oh, it's not working. I'm curious what you're saying.
Yeah, that's a great visualization. You're right. There's a lot of doubt. There's a lot of uncertainty. A lot of people. There were the glory days, I guess you can call it, right? Where
Mhm.
people are still kind of like they know what's possible. They're like, man, it doesn't feel as easy as it was like back in the day, like you said, right? And
Mhm.
so I do want to normalize and say like there are some people that are definitely going through some things, right? But it does seem like people are more intentional about what they want in life, and they're not willing to work at a job that doesn't treat them well. So I have noticed people are taking action, but there is a bit of that scarcity mindset overall, as an industry
Mhm.
is what I'm seeing.
Yeah, that's such a good way to say it. It's like we had the pre-pandemic where we knew what that work-life balance was like. Then we had the pandemic, which that was a disaster. And now we're post-pandemic, kind of trying to figure it out. But now that we have all the different views of how things were, people are being a lot more intentional about what they want to set up for themselves, what they're willing to accept, what they're not willing to accept, and also what their goals are. And just trying to figure out like, what does it look like now? How do I get towards those goals?
Hmm. Yeah, so it sounds like you're noticing people are being a bit more intentional about their next career path. And what are some of the like trends that you're noticing in terms of, are people valuing more work-life balance? Are they valuing more autonomy, flexibility? What are
Mhm.
some of the things that you're noticing when working with your clients?
So I work with enterprise and strategic account executives. So my client is somebody who's been in sales for probably 6 to 10 years. They've been doing this for a while. They maybe even been enterprise for the last 6 years. And by nature of this demographic, a lot of them have families and they have mortgages and they have young kids that they want to spend time with. And so they do want to get more done in less time. And it's tricky because when you transition from like a commercial or a mid-market or even in SMB up into enterprise, when you're in the lower level sales, it's not, I don't want to say like, I don't want to, I say lower level, not as like it's worse there, but when you're in that sales motion, it's more about at bats and it's more about understanding your script, understanding your persona. If those two things line up, then like you've got the deal. Whereas when you move into enterprise and strategic, it is more about developing the relationship, multi-threading your deals, figuring out the right people to contact, figuring out the right messaging. It's a lot more customized. It's not just like you're blasting everybody the same messaging. And so I do see a lot of people who they were successful back in commercial or mid-market, but it's because they just worked 12-hour days. And now they're in enterprise and they're not willing to work those same 12-hour days that they were working before. They want time with their family. They want time for themselves. They want time for maybe a side project that they're working on. They maybe have multiple rental properties that they also have to manage. And so it's tricky for that kind of a seller because they're looking at like, well, I want to be successful like I felt in the past, but I also I have constraints. I can't work those same hours that I worked in the past. So is it even possible for me to get back to where I was and feel that same level of fulfillment and that same level of success?
Hmm.
And you and I are here to say, like, yes, it absolutely is. And yes, you have to change things. You can't do things the same way that you've always done things because that's not going to get you where you want to go.
Hmm. That's really insightful. So what I'm hearing is an intentionality in terms of, hey, like I still want to be a intentional like husband or wife or mother or father. And there's a bit of that, like when I was younger, when I was able to really sacrifice, and not sacrifice, well, maybe sacrifice, let's be real
Yeah.
here. When I was really able to put in the effort and the elbow grease, like it got me results, right? But with these new responsibilities, with these new um whether it's like more kid like having more kids or additional
Mhm.
properties, like hey, maybe I'm also managing my Airbnbs and stuff like that. Like how do I have a life where I still get enjoyment out of my job, but I'm also still not at the expense or at the cost of like everything else, is what I'm hearing.
Totally. I'm curious what trends you're seeing with your sellers right now, as far as are they optimizing different things for what they're looking for? Are they changing
Mhm.
that? Are they, I
Yeah.
think another interesting question is like, how are you able to be intentional? I think we
Mm.
all are sold. We see our LinkedIn feed and we are sold this person that works 1 hour a day and makes tens of millions of dollars. And like, so
Oh.
you're like, well, that sounds great, but that feels like a pipe dream. Like, is that even
Mhm.
possible for me? I'm curious the trends that you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there's no substitute for hard work for sure. Like it's clear that in 2024, you still have to put in the work, right? I don't think there's ever going to be I mean, like you said, there were a few years where it just felt like it was easy. I mean, I was part of those years, right? And some of those years, like I was able to hit my number, and it wasn't necessarily because I was better, right? I think it's just timing. And so I'm not going to discount like some of it is like the macroeconomics, right? Like
Mhm.
we all have been around long enough to know that. I do think people are starting to just be a lot more intentional about their next role. Like they're not just gonna work just to pay the bills. I like a lot of and some of my demographic is probably slightly younger than I would say like your target, where they're more like their first 4, 5, 6 years into their tech sales career, or they've transitioned to the tech sales from other industries, like accounting or IT or anything like that. But it seems like people are really care about like, hey, like I actually want to enjoy the work that I do. And it's not just grinding, right? Like I actually want to learn new skills. I want to be more intentional in terms of like having a good relationship with my manager, where I think in the past people were able to put up with that just
Mhm.
because they're just like, oh, this is how it is. Like you just grind really, really hard as an SMB AE or grind really hard in mid-market and that's just what you know. But to your point, it is possible to um have it all, right? Like you don't have to sacrifice like your health to be successful. There is a path forward.
Yeah, I'm curious from your perspective, what do you feel like are the primary roadblocks or the things getting in the way of people having that work-life balance, of having a career that feels fulfilling, of having a good relationship with their manager?
Hmm. I think it's we all collect evidence to prove our hypothesis, right? So a lot of people that I speak with a lot of people on a regular basis, it's like, okay, well, if this person tells you something, like you don't have to believe what they say, right? Even if it's someone that you respect or a mentor or just someone that you look up to, like if we all have different things that we care about. So if that mentor is like, hey, like, no, like you do have to grind, you have to put in like 80-hour weeks to get to enterprise. It's like every time I hear one of those things, I collect that evidence and I'm like, oh, okay, this must be true. And then we're always trying to prove it's hard for us to really rewire our brain because we're like, well, if he says it, then it has to be true. But the
Mhm.
reality is like if you spent as much energy collecting the opposite evidence, and I know a lot of people who are making, 350, 400K that are just working a normal 40 hours a week, right? So for me, I would rather focus my energy on learning from those folks as opposed to the ones that are working 80 hours a week. And yes, they might be making, 450, 500K, but I get to choose like, okay, am I going to follow this person's footsteps or this person? It's just a matter where I allocate my attention and my energy.
I love how you're saying that your brain is always going to work finding evidence for you, and you get to decide what kind of evidence it's looking for. I remember when I first learned this, I was living in a one-bedroom apartment in San Francisco, and I would practice this. I'd be sitting in this apartment and I'd be like, I'm not kidding. I don't know why. There was this tiny room in there that was my office. I could literally touch both walls with my hands. And my desk fit perfect. It was great. You can go back and find really old videos of me in this tiny office. But I would sit there and I would think about everything that was wrong with this apartment and everything that was wrong with my living situation and how it was so horrible. And then in 1 second, I could flip it and I could be like, let's think about everything that's fantastic about this. And I could go and like you can make a case for either side of the court.
Mm,
Like you can find the evidence for
mm,
either side of the court. And it's really interesting to ask yourself, like, what evidence am I looking for?
mm,
Which one am I filtering out and which one am I like making a court case for? Because I get to decide what's there. Like
mm.
anything is possible. So which one do I want to search for?
And shout out to you, Amber, because when I was working as a sales director at Fortune, you actually helped me a lot with this, where I would be like, oh man, like I'm launching the first mentorship program of 100 in the 100 years at Fortune. Like it's a lot of pressure. I feel like we're not making as much progress. I was only able to get 36 people to join the mentorship program, and then you would always like flip. You would be like, well, like, what is that necessarily true? Like, are you doing a horrible job? And I'm like, no, actually, like this is a lot of people. Like I don't know that many companies where there's 36 people joining a mentorship program, and there's like the C-suite, the VPs, directors involved. And you were able to help me see like, no, actually, like I'm doing a great job. I'm just choosing to focus on, oh, there were 16 people that they said they were interested, but they ultimately didn't join, right? It's like, what do I want to choose on? Like really, really serving those 36 people or the 16 people that were maybes, right? And then so you actually helped me a lot with that.
I'm so glad. It's really fascinating. Our brains are always answering whatever question we give it, but we usually give our brains horrible questions like, why do I suck so bad? Our brain's like, well, let me tell you. Like, here are all the reasons. So it's really fascinating to just observe like what's going on in there. What are you paying attention to? Because you're going to find more of that. You and I were talking offline about manifestation and the law of attraction. And I think I definitely think it's a thing, but I think it's a thing because your brain is going to filter out whatever you pay attention to. So if you are
Mm.
focusing on what is everything going well, you can absolutely go find that. And you're gonna bring in more of what's going well because you're noticing it.
Hmm. So what you're referring to is called the reticular activating system. Would
Yes.
would you like to share a little bit about how you have leveraged that that reticular activating system in your life?
Yes. I'm so glad. Yeah. The ascending reticular activating system. So every second, our brain is processing millions of pieces of information, which is fascinating to think about. But with all of our five senses, it's also really interesting because your brain is kind of in a black box. It has no access to the outside world except for through your five senses. And so it's trying to take in all this information of like, okay, it feels kind of cold. I feel some wind. I hear some noise. Like, what is a threat and what is not a threat? And it's your prefront, your lower brain, your primitive brain that is like taking in all this information through your brainstem and deciding what's important and what's not important. And your primitive brain is just focused on staying alive. It is scanning for risks. We all talk about our negativity bias of like, why am I so negative? Why am I only looking for that? Well, because that's what's kept you alive. The people who that part of their brain is broken, they literally die because they're not looking for the, like, they're just like, well, it's cool. I can walk out in the middle of the street with these cars driving past, no big deal. And so your brain is inherently negative, and that's fine because that's keeping you alive, but it's helpful to notice that, like, I'm focusing on the negative. And so this part of your brain, the ascending reticular activating system, is the part that filters out what's worthwhile and what's not worthwhile. So everybody has had this situation before where maybe you're looking for a new car and you see this car that like you've never seen before, or maybe you buy a new car. And as soon as you have this car, everybody around you has this car. Like suddenly you see it everywhere. Like, what in the world? I thought this was kind of like a rare, unique car. And now I see it all over the place. And what's happening is your ascending reticular activating system, your ARAS, was filtering it out before because it wasn't important. And now it's not filtering it out because it seems like it's important. So this part of your brain is paying attention to what interests you, what feeds into your hopes or dreams, or what feeds into your fears. And so it's really helpful to be intentional about that. Of what do you want to look for? And what do you want your brain to filter for you? If you want it to filter that everything is going wrong and this is a complete disaster, like believe me, it will do that. And it will just become this downward spiral that keeps fulfilling itself. Or you can look for everything that's going right and how you're doing really well and how actually like this year is great. Like maybe it's harder, but you're learning new skills that you hadn't learned before. You're really developing other skills. Yeah, I'm curious on your thoughts about all of this because I know that you are interested in all of this too.
Yeah, I love that visual. It's interesting. So I'll just use myself as an example. Like this
Yeah.
year has definitely been one of the hardest years in terms of just a lot of different things. And I'm not gonna lie, like my survival mind, like you said, was looking for all the things that, and some of it, I'm not gonna lie, is because I'm comparing it to the past, right? So let's say
Mhm.
I had like an amazing a couple years at LinkedIn, and I was like, oh my God, I was the guy, I was like the head of, I was the ERG leader, I was the social impact chair, like I was speaking in front of high school, like, so then I'm like, oh well, this year I only spoke to 5 high schools. So at LinkedIn, I spoke to like 7 different schools. So that must mean that I'm not doing as well, right? So it's more like past based. But but then all of a sudden, like this one day, I just woke up and I just had like this abundance and gratitude. And I was like, let me write 100 people that I have gratitude for. And it was like literally the day before I was just talking about like, dude, like I don't even know how I'm gonna be able to like pay the bills tomorrow. And then like in less than 24 hours later, I wrote like a whole letter, like a whole 100 people that I have gratitude for. So within 24 hours, right? But as to your point, it's because I was like really just focused on like, actually this year I was very privileged to be able to have friends that were like, hey, do you want to speak to women at Afghanistan? So I did that a couple of times. And then I'm like, well, okay, so I was just able to focus more on like the good and focused more on, okay, like this is how I'm able to impact more people instead of being so focused on the past and oh and almost like wishing and longing like, oh, I wish it was more like what I did back in 2018, 2019, right? But it's like
Mhm.
literally within 24 hours, like a huge shift in just where I'm focusing my energy and my attention to.
Yeah. And I think it's so helpful when those moments come of like something hits you and it just like really resonates, like write it down because you can use that again later. But we always like forget it, like, oh, I'm always like, I'm definitely going to remember this. And then like 24 hours later, I'm like, what was that thing again? So write
Hmm.
it down and save it for yourself to borrow later.
Or I think what's helpful is make a video of like if you're really like just happy and you're just like one of my friends, he's one of my mentors. He always takes a selfie every day. And then
Mm.
and then he just smiles like goofy smile, but then he has like a whole album of it because because it's like his reminder not to take life so seriously. And he's a serial entrepreneur, so he always has like a lot of stuff going on. But I just found that to be so inspiring that he does it every day, and it's like always like the silliest like selfies. And sometimes he'll send me a selfie and he'll be like, "Hey, don't forget to make your good shit list," which is like writing down all the good shit that you've done for yourself or for others that day.
I love that. Yeah, they've said that your brain doesn't know. I think this is my son's pencil. Your brain doesn't know when you're smiling for real. Have you heard this one? If you hold a pencil in your teeth, it engages the same muscles as smiling and it makes you happier.
Oh,
Brain
yeah,
science.
love that.
So I'm curious to know about your experience with imposter syndrome. So I've been in sales enablement. I haven't been an actual IC seller other than in my business, which is what you do every single day. But I'm curious for you what imposter syndrome felt like when you were in sales. If you experienced it, maybe you didn't.
Yeah, definitely. I would say I'm a deeply sensitive and emotional dude. And I'm not the tallest dude. I'm like 5'3.5", which, probably the shortest guy, especially in sales, right? Because I remember working at like Trinet, for instance, and then the people that are on my team are like 6'3", like, they're like almost got drafted by the Phillies and, like just good looking dudes, right? Or people that look like Brandon Fluharty. I'm not gonna lie, he's a pretty good looking tall dude, right?
Yeah, gray hair.
And yeah, exactly. And so it was not only am I usually the only Asian person on my team, but I'm usually the only Vietnamese person. At least in New York City, there's just not a lot of Viets that are in tech sales. So it's hard not to compare yourself. So imposter syndrome, I would say, has consumed my life like pretty much everywhere. In publishing the 4 books and then another one coming out, like my story was like I barely even like past school. Like I almost flunked out of college and did not get good grades and just was not a good student. And so yeah, I would say it's showed up in like pretty much every aspects of my life, like even including doing this. Like this is I think the 7th live stream and this, but the first couple, I'm like, why would anyone listen to us talk for an hour? Like that's so weird, like a lot of
Yeah,
emotions around that. So
yeah. I want to just point out a couple things of imposter syndrome that you outlined so perfectly. One of the major aspects of imposter syndrome is that you feel like you're the odd one out. And so you have a lot of different ways that you felt like the odd one out of you were shorter than your peers, you were the only Asian of your peers, you were the only Vietnamese of your peers. And so finding all these ways that you're the odd one out, and that shows up whether you're a minority, whether you're a different gender than most people, or a different orientation to meet different people. And it definitely shows up for you would be so surprised of all the people who look like your typical high performing salesperson, but they feel like they have a different background or experience than everybody else. And so that's how they discount themselves and feel like they're the imposter because maybe they didn't graduate college or maybe they didn't come through. Everybody has this traditional sales background in their head of like, I didn't come through the traditional way to get to sales. And I'm like, what the heck is the traditional way to get into sales? There's no degree in sales. Like, what's the traditional way? And how come you are discounting yourself like you came through sales engineering or you came through account management or you came through recruiting? Like however you came into sales was the right way to get into sales. And whatever your background is, like, is the right way to get into it. There's no
mhm.
traditional background. There's no like tests that you have to pass.
Hmm.
But people have this idea that like if I didn't go the traditional way, then like somehow I don't fit in here with my peers. But you'd ask anybody, like, I don't think there is a traditional way. They all think it's like, oh, you start out as an SDR out of college and then you work your way up. But I actually think that the people who have backgrounds in other areas have so much more perspective to be able to sell more. So
Hmm.
I think that that probably is a benefit to you rather than like coming up through us with an SDR.
Hmm. That's a great point, right? We can also collect evidence on, oh, well, 6 out of the 7 people that this team that I'm applying to, if I'm trying to get promoted to the enterprise team, let's say a mid-market rep,
Mhm.
has come from other like Salesforce, Google, LinkedIn, Microsoft, like well known, and then we can collect that, and then we're like, well, I don't have that. That means I'm automatically screwed, right?
Mhm.
Versus how about I reach out and I search for people who come from more of my background, whether that's like, hey, I worked for more of like smaller startups, or I come from sales enablement, but I want to transition to enterprise sales, right? It's am I going to allocate more energy towards the first one where I'm like shooting myself in the foot, or am I going to actually collect evidence for that it is possible to transition from being a sales trainer going straight into enterprise AE?
Yeah, I think it just depends on what you're looking for. So my story of imposter syndrome was that I went to, well, the whole story is I grew up in poverty. I didn't graduate high school. I did end up graduating college, which I love that you mentioned that too. Like it's so crazy how intense those grades feel and how it feels like such a measurement of our worth when we're in high school or college or whatever. And then when you're in the regular world, like nobody gives a flying whatever about your grades. Like they don't matter. And it's so interesting how it's just measuring one aspect of your intelligence. Like how well are you at taking tests? Which
Mm-hmm.
turns out there's not a lot of tests in the professional world. So like maybe your grades don't really mean anything. Anyway, so I graduated high school. I did graduate college. I went to the University of Utah, like a state school, and then fast forward, I find myself living and working in San Francisco. I'm working for a unicorn tech startup. We reached the $1 billion valuation, and I'm surrounded by people. I'd been promoted a ton. I was managing a team for the first time. I was hiring people, and I was surrounded by people that went to Ivy League schools. And it's interesting how I say this because I'm like, I was surrounded by. And if I were to ask myself, like, how many of these people actually went to Ivy League schools, it was probably two.
Huh.
Yeah, like, but in my head, it was like, oh, they're all so much smarter than you. You went to this state school, like state school. They're probably super smart. They all know that you're not supposed to be here. They
Hmm.
know that you like grew up poor, like you don't deserve any of this. And it's so interesting how that imposter syndrome just creeps in because you feel like the odd one out, like,
Hmm.
they're gonna find out. They're gonna like somebody's gonna shine a spotlight on me and be like, we got you out. You're making all of this up. Like, you're out of here.
Yeah, that's hilarious. When you said that, I also thought back to him like actually not everyone was like a tall, good-looking like white dude. That's how I'm remembering it. But now I'm like, actually, I'm sure there were a lot of other a lot of diversity, but I'm just like choosing not to mention it or but it's like almost like I'm like, no, trust me, like it wasn't diverse, it's like so there's like
Yeah,
this battle back and forth.
right. Which is again like that brain filtering of like, what are you looking for? Are you looking for the like typical sales, whatever that's not even a thing. Like, there's no such thing as normal. There's no such thing as typical. Like, we all have it in our brains that like don't fit this mold, then you're not gonna make it here.
I do so it looks like there's some questions. Sebastian, do you want to get off mute and ask your question to Amber?
Hey Amber, yeah, nice to meet you. Wanted to see what your framework is for believing in yourself, like being able to hit any quota that's in front of you, like no matter the timeline, or like having the confidence to get any job you want. Some days you believe in yourself, and then other days things don't go as well, and you start
Mhm.
having self-doubt. Like, how do you overcome that?
Sebastian, I really appreciate your bravery in asking this question because I'm sure when you're saying it, you're like, I'm definitely the only person who feels this way. And I just want to say you're definitely not. And I want to point out what Davidson was talking about actually when he talked about he's doing these lives and he feels like, oh man, like who am I to be doing these like LinkedIn lives every day? And confidence is so misunderstood. A lot of people think that confidence is something that you're born with and it's something that like is in your DNA. This is what I thought. So I'm at this unicorn tech startup and everybody else seemed like they knew what they were doing. And in my head, I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm making all of this up. For sure, someone's going to find out. And I thought that maybe it was just my DNA that like I wasn't a confident person. I would never be confident like others. What confidence actually is confidence comes through action. I'm going to give Davidson's example. If you have given 7 LinkedIn lives, and here's the key, you didn't die, then you might have confidence that you can do it again. So your brain is always like I always think about when I'm heaven forbid training for like a half marathon. As soon as I start running again, my brain's like, this for sure is going to kill you. You definitely shouldn't go running. Like, this is a horrible idea. Because your brain is optimizing for three things. Your primitive brain is still stuck in caveman times. Our brains haven't evolved as fast as society has evolved. So your brain is optimizing to reduce energy because it doesn't know where the next meal is going to come from, avoid pain because that might kill you, and seek pleasure. If you find berries or something that are sweet and tasty, like, you need to go find more of those. And so reducing pain, avoiding effort, and seeking pleasure aren't really what get you ahead in today's society. That's what your brain is optimizing for. And so my brain, when I tell it, okay, we're going to go for a run, my brain's like, this is a horrible idea. It sounds painful. It sounds like a lot of energy and it doesn't sound pleasurable. But I know that if I just keep going and keep on with my routine, then there becomes a point where suddenly going for those runs isn't hard anymore. Like, my brain stops resisting it. And it's almost as if my brain is like, okay, we did it this many times and we didn't die. So I think we can move this to the approved list. And I'm sure, like, Davidson, you've experienced this. I'm sure, Sebastian, you've experienced this in other areas of your career as well. Once you do the thing enough times, not only does your brain stop resisting it, now you have confidence that you can do it again. But the confidence comes through action. Like, nobody is born confident that they can give a phenomenal demo. Nobody is born confident that they can run an amazing discovery call. I'm very certain nobody is born confident that they can cold call and, like, be fantastic at it. And so the way that you build that confidence is through taking action. And this is what James Clear talks about in his book, Atomic Habits, that action builds the identity. Once you've taken enough action, you then have evidence that this is my identity. I'm somebody who's great at cold calling. I'm somebody who's great at discovery calls. I'm somebody who's great at demos. But it comes through the action. And so, Sebastian, in your situation, you asked about, like, how do you have confidence that you can hit your quota? I, for myself, focus more on my actions and my behaviors of, like, I'm going to just put in the reps. I know that the confidence is going to come. And I started my coaching business 6 years ago, and I hadn't ever done sales calls before. And so then when I was trying to do sales calls and sell myself, I was like, I'm an absolute fraud. Like, the people are going to see right through me. And, like, I'm trying to sell myself, but, like, I don't even have confidence in myself. And now I've done thousands of sales calls, and I don't blink an eye. It doesn't feel scary. It doesn't feel overwhelming. I have complete confidence that I can go in and I can have a great close ratio. Like, I know that I can go in and I can have a great sales call and I can make a difference in somebody else's world. So what I would focus on, rather than, am I feeling confident today or am I not feeling confident today? I would focus on, like, putting in the repetitions of doing the work, putting in those actions, and pretty soon you're going to have complete confidence that you can do all those things. David, so I'm curious your opinion on all this.
I love that. Yeah, it's like it's not easy to do. I don't want to say easy, right? Because that's like labeling it, but it's not like the live streams, for instance, right? It was definitely outside my comfort zone because I'm like, hey, like, why would someone listen? And then, but then afterwards, when I look back, I'm like, oh, okay, like, wow, 250 people watch this live stream. Like, for instance, like, I'm guessing probably around, like, even right now, there's people that are watching, right? So if I'm more focused on my identity, my ego, then it's like, oh, I gotta deliver value. I gotta, like, whereas I'm just focused on, like, okay, let me just think back to, like, that handful of clients that, like, or that text message I got yesterday that's like, thank you, like, I made it to the next round, like, I couldn't have done it without you. It's like, should I focus more on, like, me, or should I focus more on, like, how I want to serve? I want to be able to let my family and my wife have this amazing life that she deserves, that we deserve, right? It's the same thing. So it just propels me to get outside my comfort zone and take bigger risk.
Mhm. Yeah, that insecurity comes when you're thinking about yourself. If you're thinking about the other person, you can't feel insecure. So my trick has always been to, like, rather than, like, thinking about myself, like, what are they thinking of me? How am I doing? Is this great? Is this not great? And so try to put myself in the head of the other person. Like, how are they feeling? Are they feeling comfortable? Is there something that I can do to make them feel more comfortable? What are their questions? What are their hesitations? And putting yourself inside the brain of the person that you're trying to serve makes it so that the insecurity drops and you're able to not let that ego get out of control. Yeah.
Is that helpful, Sebastian? Do you have any follow-up questions in regards to that?
Yeah, I guess the takeaway is like practice, 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 and you'll kind of get in the habit and feel confident and overcome the doubts.
Mm-hmm. There's two other ways that you can feel confident. So my number one recommendation is action. The second way is you can borrow confidence from other areas of your life. So my first job out of college, I was working at a nonprofit and we had all these networking events and I had no idea how to network. I was so intimidated by the prospect of going to these networking events. But at the same time, I was learning how to mountain bike and I'd done this like, I don't know, 14-mile trail that's all downhill. It's in Moab, Utah. I crashed 7 times. I cried 3 times, but I like did the whole thing. And I had only started learning to mountain bike that year. And I was like, if I can do that, I can have a conversation with somebody. So there's always ways you can borrow confidence from other areas of your life too. Like I've figured it out in the past. I have a 100% track record of figuring things out. And I know I'm going to do it again. And then the last way to borrow confidence or to have confidence is really kind of interesting, but the worst thing that can happen in any scenario is that you feel a feeling. So like, let's say you bomb a cold call or somebody yells at you or whatever, like something bad happens. We always think like, oh, that's the worst thing that could happen. The worst thing that could happen is that happens and then you feel embarrassment or you feel humiliation or you feel disappointment or you feel a feeling. And it's really interesting when you realize that you've survived all of those feelings. Like you felt all those feelings before and you've survived it. So when you kind of tell yourself the worst case scenario is that I feel a feeling, and I'm actually pretty good at feeling feelings, then you can also build confidence. That one's like master level confidence building, but it's interesting to think about. So feeling is a sensation that triggers in your body. Your brain in its black box says like, I think we're being threatened. So it sends a signal to your rest of your body of like trigger, fight or flight, like make sure the muscles can run and like stop the digestion. And then once that flight or that threat is gone, then it kind of calms it down, it goes through your system and then it's over. Those feelings aren't going to last forever. So it's interesting to kind of build confidence that way. Like the worst case scenario is that I feel a feeling. I'm pretty good at feeling feelings. So if I can just like allow myself to like be in this, it's okay that I feel this way. It's not going to last. It's going to go away. Then you can have confidence to take more risks and do those things that feel really scary right now.
I do want to
Thank you.
add, it seems like because we're both in the context of business, a lot of us or most people in the LinkedIn community who are watching or who will be watching this are typically in the context of business, right? I think business people inherently are like very cerebral, like we're very like in our heads a lot. So I love what you said about like actually like feeling the feelings and pinpointing down. So let's say I'm having like a rough week and I'm in survival mode. It's like, okay, like what are the actual emotions, right? It's like, okay, there's embarrassment, I'm ashamed, I'm I'm feeling scarcity. Like I think just like pinpointing it to like specifics is helpful because then we could process it versus like when it's in our head all the time and we don't have someone to talk to about it or we're not journaling about it, then it's just subconsciously or unconsciously we're just thinking it anyways. But just having
Mhm.
someone to talk to and someone to process it with just makes it real and then we can do something with it, right? Versus just being in our heads subconsciously or unconsciously and living there went rent free for years and years.
Totally. Yeah. And another way that you can engage your prefrontal cortex in that is writing it down. I think you and I are both verbal processors that we prefer to talk it out with somebody, which is great if you can. And you can even talk it out. I have like a little tiki man on my desk that sometimes I just talk to him and like, hey man, this is what's going on. So like you can talk to an inanimate object to like verbally process it out. But another great way to do it is by writing it out. And sometimes I'll even like talk to text into my phone and just like talk it all out. And then when I see it, I'm like, oh, this is fascinating. I did that one time because I was working with a personal trainer and I was like, I'm not even doing the workouts. Like, this is why am I paying for this? I'm not even doing the workouts. This is so hard. And then later I was like, and I'm not even seeing the results. Like, I'm not even like, it doesn't even seem like I'm making a difference here. And then when I read it back, I was like, Amber, you're not getting results because you're not doing the workouts. And I was like, ah, cool. Like now I understand what's going on, and I was able to like move past it, like get back on the course and ready to go again.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, this is a super interesting conversation. I think a lot of tech sellers, like I'm curious to see what your take is on this, but it seems like a lot of us always chase the hamster wheel and we're like, oh, well, once I get to the, once I maybe this year, once I make $465,000, I'll be happy, right? And it's like, well, no, actually, and then once you hit that, like, no, no, never mind, maybe 600,000, I'll be happy, right? What are your thoughts on the hedonic treadmill and that? Are you seeing that when people actually do hit their goals, like they are happier? Or is it more about the process? Curious to hear your thoughts.
Davidson, you hit your goal, you're going to be happy forever. It lasts. No, studies have shown that yes, you do feel happier when you hit your goal for a short period of time and it fades pretty quickly. And so, have we talked about Enneagram? Do you know what your Enneagram is?
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
an enthusiast.
What number is that? Is that 5?
Yes. I believe.
Okay.
Let me double check.
Yeah. So I'm an Enneagram 3. It's the achiever, and achievers are only as successful as they only feel as successful as their last big success. We're always chasing new successes.
Hmm.
And it's tricky if you haven't had a success for a while because you just feel like you're a failure. So the happiness that comes from achieving a milestone is real. However, for most of my clients, because they're in enterprise and strategic account executives, like the difference that they have once they achieve a particular goal, it's that satisfaction is fleeting. It's not going to last forever. And also it's not making a huge monumental change in their life. Like I remember when I was in high school and I was like, can you imagine even having a car? Like it would be so amazing. You could drive anywhere that you want to. And getting that car did make a huge difference in my life. It felt different and it was more of a lasting change. If I buy a new car now, yes, temporarily I'm happy and I'm like more delighted with this car, but that satisfaction goes away because it's not like I'm going from no car to a car. I'm going from like a car to a nicer car.
Hmm.
And it's kind of the same thing with a lot of our tech sellers. Like you've already kind of reached a level of monetary value that like has made a big difference in your life. And like the next chunk is not going to make that big of a difference. And so I definitely, for myself and for all my clients, I'm always trying to focus on, let's focus on the journey and let's focus on the process. The wins are super fun. But if we can make every day feel more fulfilling and more satisfying, then that's what's going to create the enjoyment and the happiness that we get out of our life. And I also like to, on a separate train, I also like to think about like anything that we do or don't do is because of a feeling that we want to feel. And so I always like to ask myself, like, what is the feeling that I'm chasing by going after this goal? How do I think I'm going to feel? And can I just evoke that feeling for myself right now? Which doesn't mean I'm not going to go after the goal, but it means probably I'm going to get closer to the goal more quickly because I'm already feeling the feeling that I want to feel.
Hmm.
Like if you think about weight loss, it's like, well, I want to lose weight or I want to have a certain body because then I'm going to feel happy with myself. But the problem is you could lose all that weight and you still bring your same brain with you. Your brain's going to have the same thoughts, going to go with the same feelings. So why not start your journey and start to feel the happiness or satisfaction or delight with yourself that you want to feel at the end of the goal, but why not just feel it through the whole process?
Hmm. Yeah, I think, and it's interesting because type 3s on the Enneagram is the most common out of all my Asian friends.
Oh yeah.
So and you're in California, so you're probably
Yeah.
surrounded by a lot of us.
Yeah.
But I did this because I being a campaigner, which is the ENFP on the Myers-Briggs,
Yes.
which was what my last book was about, like the campaigner type. Like I asked like 100 of my friends to do like the Enneagram thing, and no exaggeration, like 80% of my Asian friends were all type 3s. And I'm like, how's that even possible? Is that like a cultural thing? But yeah, I just found that super fascinating. So I can definitely
Yeah.
relate to what you're saying.
Yeah, there's definitely, I mean, I don't know that much about Enneagram, but I feel like for me in particular, with growing up in poverty, it's like, this is how I prove my worth. If I can just be successful and achieve, and like, this is how I can feel good enough about myself. And I don't know like the background behind that, but yeah, it's interesting to look at and interesting to understand while also trying to not get caught up in it because it can be a hedonic treadmill, just like you were saying. I'm curious for you what you're seeing with your clients and kind of how you think about the hedonic treadmill or ways that you reframe
Hmm.
that.
Yeah, that it's interesting, right? Because we always attract who we are like a few years ago, right? Like as a coach, it's very meta, where it's like what you're going through is like what your clients are going through, and the breakthrough you have is what your clients' breakthrough will have. So for me, a lot of my clients, it's like, well, once I reach like the enterprise, like AE, I get a fat OTE of 300, like I'll be happy, it's great, right? Because I have a client for a year and that's what we focus on. And then once they reach it, then it's like sometimes even as quick as like 6 months later, it's like, hey, like I actually don't really like this. Like it's actually I'm losing a lot of sleep, like so stressful. I haven't been able to like visit my family in a while because I'm working like 60-hour weeks and it's just not as enjoyable. And it's like, huh, that's interesting. So after doing a lot of pattern recognition, you realize like, okay, maybe it's actually less about getting that job, getting that promotion, and more of like, well, what are your values? Like, what do you care about, right? And then so now half of my conversation is more towards like those types of values and less. And yes, some of it's still the more tactical, like mock interviews and stuff like that. But I also want people to focus also on like what do you actually care about? And I call that like intentional legacy crafting.
Mhm. This is where I feel like you are such I don't know what to call it, like such a amazing coach because you bring in so much thoughtfulness about how you structure your life and what is going to give you the most life fulfillment. And are you living your values? And do you even know what your values are? And once you are aligned with your values and living them every day, you're going to feel so much more happiness. So you bring so much of the like life purpose into things, but also the tactics. Like we're like, okay, you're having a hard time interviewing. Like, let's fix that. Like that's easily solvable. We can change that today. I think it's really cool how you bring such an overarching perspective of life while also like narrowing in. I'm like, okay, but here's how to do that. It doesn't have to be all like very meta. Like, let's narrow it. Like, here's how to
Yeah.
write a proposal that
Yeah.
will do really well.
No, and even just hearing that, like there's definitely like imposter syndrome and even being with that feedback, right? It's like, yeah, but I'm not Amber. Like Amber, like be coaching multi-million-dollar like earners. Like I'm not on that level. So it's interesting.
Yeah,
Like it's like what we're saying, it's like I don't think imposter syndrome ever quote unquote goes away. But it's
yeah,
like I get to choose like, okay, like that's uncomfortable. Like let me sit with that afterwards. And it's like, okay, like no, she's doing it at the like out of the genuine kindness and just an observation, just a data point that she
yeah,
so it's like, huh, that's interesting. And how can I embrace that versus like, oh, I need to prove myself and like that means like I need to make more money or like land like really high-end clients. Like it's like, what do I get to choose from that? Am I going to choose to have to prove myself or am I going to choose like okay like how can I embrace that and like integrate that into my coaching more.
yeah. It's, I mean, the comparison piece is so wild. I think I'm right around, I'm almost crossed over 15,000 followers on LinkedIn. And whenever I look at that number, I'm like, that's not anything. That's nothing. That's nothing. Look at the people who have 50,000 followers. Look at the people who have 100,000 followers, 150,000, 300,000 followers. Like, girl, this is nothing. And it was so fascinating. I went to a Justin Timberlake concert and I'm looking around at this stadium and I was like, this is so many people. And I was like, how many people is this actually? And so I look it up and they were like, for concerts, it is at the SAP Center in San Jose. And for concerts, it's generally 15,000 to sometimes 18,000 people. And they had like the whole back of it behind the stage was all blocked off. There was nobody back there.
Mm,
And so I was like, let's just imagine this is 15,000 people. And
mm,
looking around, I was like, this is a massive number of people. Like if I
mm,
think about anytime I post, this many people have access, and probably more than that, this many people have
mm,
access to what I'm trying to share. Like that makes such a difference. And for you and I, like we thrive in the one person saying, you made such a difference. And so, like, I don't know, the
mm.
comparison is something I'm thinking about a lot lately of like, what if we didn't compare ourselves? And I always try to focus on like, what is my personal best? How can I beat Amber yesterday? Because I'm very competitive. Believe me, I want to beat somebody. So it's like, what if I just focus on my personal best? Like, how can I be 1% better
Mm.
than yesterday? and not compare myself to everybody else and like discount myself compared to everybody else. Because when you and I look at where we started and where we've gotten to, it's it's wild. Like we should not have arrived where we have arrived.
Mm.
And I think most tech sellers would feel that way too. It's like
Hmm.
if your high school self saw you today, they'd be like, "What? Are you for real? You drive what? You live in what? Like
Mm.
this is the craziest thing I've ever seen."
Yeah, that's profound what you're saying. Like if you, because that's you, right? You're Justin Timberlake in the sense that you have 15,000 people that are commenting, getting value from your insights. And if you sit with that and you just like visualize you're the person on stage and whatever
Mhm.
hundreds of thousands of impressions that you get on an annual basis, right? Like when you think of it in that way, like that's pretty wild. Like even the fact that there's 250 people that are gonna like watching this throughout the course of the hour,
Yes.
like to get 250 people in a room, like
Right.
that's scary. Like that would be like I would be very nervous if I actually saw real people, like 250 real people like listening. But
Yeah.
it's like sometimes we don't acknowledge ourselves, or we're always like on to the next one. It's like, well, yeah, but has like 49,000 followers. Like it's
Yeah.
like I'm not even like a third of that. It's like okay.
Yeah. Right. Like, could you convince 6 people to come listen to you talk right now in a room? Probably not. And yet, like, 6 people are listening to us talk. Hello, 6 people who are listening in. Like, we're so glad to be spending this time with you. So it's really interesting when you just like narrow it in of like, rather than compare myself to everybody else and like where they are, like, I'm going to compare myself to myself and how much progress have I made and how far have I gotten. And I want to talk about this, the imposter syndrome part where you said, I don't know if it even ever actually goes away. So I just want to like, if anybody who listens to anything, please know anybody who has achieved anything worthwhile experiences imposter syndrome. People who have won Oscars are like, for sure, they're going to take this away from me because they're going to find out that I made it all up. People who have won Pulitzer Prizes, people who are multi-platinum recording artists, they all talk about the imposter syndrome that they feel. Like I remember I saw a quote from Maya Angelou, and she was like, every single time I publish a book, I just think they're gonna figure it out. The jig is gonna be up. Like this is the time. Like Maya Angelou, she's so phenomenal. And people like J Lo, people like Jodie Foster, like there's so many people who experience imposter syndrome. And imposter syndrome is not a sign that you're not supposed to be here. Imposter syndrome is not a sign that you're not cut out for this. It's a sign of growth. It's a sign that you're stretching yourself past your comfort zone. And it's about the repetitions we talked about earlier. If you just put in the repetitions, pretty soon that piece that you feel imposter about right now is going to go away. Like I'm sure Davidson, for you, there were times early in your career, like your first cold calls, your first discovery calls, your first demos, your first building out a proposal. Like all those times felt so uncomfortable and you felt like a massive imposter. And now when you think about that, you're like, yeah, cold calling, done tons of times, no big deal. So I always love to point out like imposter syndrome, yes, it won't go away. But that's because you're the kind of person that's going to continue to grow. You and like everybody that's listening in, you're the kind of person that isn't willing to feel complacent, which to me, complacency is the opposite of imposter syndrome. People who are complacent in their career never feel like an imposter because they're not growing. They're not pushing themselves outside of their comfort zone. But people who are willing to achieve big things have to go in that growth phase. And I just want to point out that the imposter syndrome doesn't go away, but what you feel imposter syndrome about does go away. I used to feel like an imposter every time I was getting on a sales call with a new potential client. And I don't feel like that anymore because I've done that thousands of times. Or I felt like an imposter when I would coach somebody. And I don't feel like that anymore because I've done it tons of times. But now I feel like an imposter when I'm like, I don't know, writing a new launch email sequence because that's a skill that I'm trying to learn. Or I feel like an imposter when I'm like changing the way that I write my posts and trying it a new way because that's a skill I need to learn. That's a skill that I need to develop. And so notice that, yes, you still feel like an imposter, but you feel like an imposter for something different. And the things that you used to feel like an imposter for, that has gone away. It's all just a phase.
Yeah, now you're reminding me of when I was at Fortune magazine. You definitely helped me be able to reframe anytime I feel really uncomfortable, which especially as an entrepreneur, new full-time entrepreneur, like that's certainly more common, like as opposed to tech sales, because at least it's like if I'm moving up from SME to mid-market, it's like I'm still in sales. So it's the motions are for the most part pretty similar versus like going from making a boatload of money to like, all right, overnight, it's like you're not going to get health insurance, any, 401k, like it's a whole new level of imposter syndrome. So it's interesting. But I love how you're framing it as, because I think we get to interpret like how we get to choose what we want to interpret things as, right? So let's say for the first 2 months as an entrepreneur, I could focus on like, oh man, like I'm so used to making like this 275 OTE or whatever, right? Or I'm so used to being 125% of my number, but this year I'm only at like 70% of my number, right? So we can choose to be like, oh man, like I guess those are the glory days, like it's over for me, right? Or we can choose to be like, oh, okay, maybe it's because I've stepped into like my first, like now is my first year as a strat AE, or it's my first year being a player coach where I'm a team lead, right? It's so of course it's going to be a little bit different, but I think if we're too attached to the past, sometimes that affects us and our and we have anxiety and depression around it.
Totally. Yeah. It feels like the theme of this live is pay attention to what you're focusing on. Your brain will just run wild. It's going to focus on something that's not particularly helpful. So just like switch it, focus on something that is helpful for you. I'm curious, Davidson, if people want to learn more about you, working with you, where do they go?
Yeah, I've been I have a Calendly link that will have some questions for you to answer just to figure out, what are your goals? What are like, have you worked with a coach before? I do realize that a lot of SDRs, this is their first time working with a coach, but it's why I'm like more focused on the early to mid stage career, like SMB AEs and up to mid market AEs, because I do realize this is an underserved community, and I think there's just a lot of potential if you work on yourself earlier on, right? Versus like later on, you're just optimizing for like, okay, how can I make another extra 100,000? But earlier on, like this builds like a really strong foundation. And what about yourself? What's the best way to get in touch with you, learn more about your framework and what you're doing to help tech sellers?
You can find me on LinkedIn. I post a lot on LinkedIn, and then you can come check out my website, mentalmastery.com. If you want to join my newsletter, you can email me. I have a guide that teaches you all about how to overcome imposter syndrome and not feel that weight of it. I think about imposter syndrome like you're swimming in ski gear. Like the art of selling is not, it's difficult. It's not like it's like super easy and it's very commonplace. It's like swimming. It still takes a lot of effort, but you don't have to swim with ski gear on. Like if it's ski boots, ski suit, like just gonna weigh you down. So like let's take the ski suit off and then you can swim so much more easily through the water. Like it's still gonna be an effort, but like it's gonna be a lot easier. So feel free to join my newsletter. If you hit reply, you'll get me directly and I'll send you over my imposter syndrome guide.
Yeah, and shout out to Amber. I remember when I was at Fortune, like I was meeting with C-suite executives of Fortune 100 companies, right? Like the CHRO at Xerox and IBM and all these like people that, let's just say my imposter syndrome definitely kicked in a lot, right? When it came to prepping for those, adding value in those meetings, etc. But I remember your framework was like very specific and it was like very easy to go through, right? Like when you went through that framework with me, it was so simple that I was like, is it this simple?
Mhm.
So I just want to acknowledge you and thank you for helping me. If it wasn't for you and Ian and a few other coaches, like I wouldn't have had the courage to start my own business, and now I'm able to impact more lives because of it. So I just want to say thank you for that.
Of course. It's been a pleasure. BFFs for life.
Awesome. Well, if you guys have any questions, post. So yeah, you'll see Amber's LinkedIn profile right on this, and then this will be the cool thing about LinkedIn Lives is it'll be on here. It looks like it's evergreen content. So if you guys weren't able to make the live, oh there you go. Yep, Amber just posted it. If you weren't able to make the live, and if you found this valuable, just write a comment and what specifically you enjoyed, and then that'll help us create additional content in regards to some of the things that you might be struggling with or dealing with currently. But thanks for joining, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.